Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
The Trump administration's determination to reduce the size of government, regardless of cost, is having a hard impact on the National Park Service. Last month, the agency was forced to rescind job offers to seasonal workers, saw a hold placed on millions of dollars distributed through the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act to address climate change, and was told to prepare a reduction in force list of employees. Now, on top of that, the agency was told it could hire no more than one employee for every 4 let go. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. There was a wee bit of good news late last week with the decision on Friday to allow the Park Service to hire 5,000 seasonal workers. But at the same time, the agency was told to fire 1,000 probationary workers. Discussing these developments and their impact on the parks and the Park Service are Kristen Brengel, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Parks Conservation Association, and Phil Francis, Chair of the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks. We'll be back in a minute with Phil and Kristen.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Well, welcome back to the Traveler, Kristen, Phil. Good to have you. I wish it was happier times.
Are we?
That's an understatement.
Usually we don't get into hard news about political machinations to the National Park Service, but these are certainly different times that we're experiencing today. On the Traveler, we've interviewed some folks who say that depending on how the hiring freeze goes and how the reduction of force goes and whatnot, that visitor services could be diminished unlike any other time since World War II. I mean, what's your take? Is that hyperbole? Or, Phil, you worked for the Park Service for 40-some years. What is your perspective on what's going on and the impact on the parks?
Well, there's been a trend that's taken place since the 80s of reducing staff. I think the best fiscal year that I could find for numbers of park employees was back in fiscal year 10. But before that, it was certainly during the Reagan years, there was a movement to try to reduce the number of employees. And then later, during, I think it was the Clinton years, they eliminated 3 of the 10 regional offices. And so the number of employees once was somewhere around 26,000, I think. And I think the number of FTEs that exist these days, is much less than that. I looked at the Blue Ridge Parkway, for example, and the Smokies, comparing 2023 and 2010. The Smokies had lost 20% of their staff, and the Blue Ridge Parkway has lost 25%.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that's not including what's happening now and what may happen in the future. And the odd thing is, the really strange thing is that the economic benefit of both of those parks is over, gosh, $2 billion combined. And it's a significant benefit to the communities around. So why I don't understand why people are supporting this action. It doesn't seem to me to be in their best interest
Yeah.
because they're really dependent upon the national parks. Whenever we close the national parks, and I used to have to close them from time to time, in the Smokies as well as Blue Ridge, I get phone calls from members of Congress and local folks and the press, saying, why the park closed? And so we were able to actually take the reporters and the members of Congress out inside the park and show them why. But they just couldn't believe that they're closed. But so I would ask that question now. Why are we doing this? To what benefit? It's hard for me to understand.
Kristen, what are the hard numbers that you've seen in terms of reduction in force, or there's been talk about a hiring freeze, a freeze on seasonal hirings, probationary employees getting let go. What have you heard?
So we got word very early on in the administration that anyone who had a job offer, it was being pulled back. And what was interesting about that was that we had to do a lot of ground truthing to try to figure out exactly how many people that was. And finally got a hard number that they had pulled back about 2,000 job offers. And in regular NPCA and the coalition that Phil runs, in our usual style, we immediately went out and let the public know how damaging this would be, because we learned that these were seasonal positions that were mostly pulled back. So what's transpired since then is that we've been making a public case for restoring Park Service positions and reminding people that we are a month away from spring break, when many, many parks get very busy with a lot of visitors, and not having those important positions filled would be very harmful to the park itself, and then also problematic with visitor safety and other experience issues. So weeks have gone by and we've heard so much about the administration's implementation of these efficiencies and the need to widely in the federal government eliminate more jobs. And so many numbers have flown around. And we've just been making a case publicly that Park Service staff are just key to making sure these places are operational, and reminding people what parks are like, that they're not just statues. They're incredible places that are sometimes towns or villages with lots of roads, sewer systems, water treatment, everything you can imagine, lodging. And so we've been engaging members of Congress who've written countless letters to the administration saying parks are too important. And we really thought we would be sitting here today saying, they got it. They understand that not only do parks need all of these staff people because they're currently understaffed, but that they're too important to the public and the economy to allow the hiring freeze to continue there. Unfortunately, today, what we've learned is that while the administration has agreed to allow 5,000 seasonal staff hirings to move forward and to claw back that original decision to not fulfill those jobs in the early days of the administration. So now they're going to allow for 5,000 seasonals to be hired, and some of the people who lost their job opportunity to have it restored. We found out today that the administration is going to fire 1,000 Park Service career staff, people who are in their probationary periods. And this is completely indiscriminate. They are not looking at what these folks do. They are just slashing the jobs. And the result of this, from what we have found out already, are that some of the people in their probationary period have jobs like wastewater treatment operators. These are the people who keep parks from smelling like sewers. Several big parks had these positions in a probationary period and will lose these people today. So when we talk about visitor experience in parks, we're usually talking about whether visitor centers will be open and toilets will be clean. Can you imagine going to a park this summer, a big park, and there's no one to operate their wastewater treatment?
Well, do you know
Awful.
how will they choose those 1,000 positions?
They're not choosing them. They're just doing it. They're saying 1,000 positions off. And they did not think through who was getting fired.
Somebody has to identify which individual is going to lose their job.
Yeah.
Apparently, according to the phone calls that I've received this morning, the people who are being fired today are essential positions in parks who happen to be on probationary period. This was a thoughtless, reckless decision today. It was not thought through, Kurt. It was done with the height of recklessness.
No, I understand it. I'm just wondering, how do they decide whether some of those come from Yellowstone, which had a flood a couple of years ago that wiped out the Mammoth wastewater treatment plant situation, or Great Smoky Mountains where Phil has worked? I mean, somebody has to decide who gets those pink slips.
No, they just took a number and slashed those jobs. That has been confirmed to me by several sources. And we're talking about parks from the East Coast to the West Coast and the Intermountain region. Even Yellowstone isn't immune to this decision to slash jobs. All of them are having probationary period people fired today.
But at the same time, they decided to allow some seasonal hirings to go forward?
This is a majority of seasonal hirings because it's about 5,000. And there are, based on the financials year to year, there are anywhere between 6,000 and 8,000 seasonals in the national park system. So having 5,000 of those positions restored is a majority of seasonals. But seasonals are great. And Phil, please talk about how awesome seasonal workers are. Some of these career positions are absolutely essential for parks.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They are essential for parks. But like you just said, Kristen, the permanent staff should not be overlooked. They do heroic things. They save lives every year. The maintenance crew, the planning crews, the resource management crew, it's all integrated. If you take away part of something, you have less of the whole. And it's really important that all of those pieces are together in order to make these operations work. It takes the seasonals because there's increasing visitation. In the summertime or the visitor season, Everglades may be the winter season. But all of these jobs are connected, and the purpose is the same, and that is to provide for visitor enjoyment and protect the natural and cultural resources. So it's going to be impactful, to say the least. It's hard for me to understand the rationale. Once again, I think I may have mentioned this before, but the economic benefit of those two parks alone is over $2 billion. And the total budget for those two parks is somewhere around $30 million. So $30 million for over $2 billion benefit is pretty good. I mentioned this to a group I spoke to outside of Charlotte, and I told them about the return on investment. And one of the people raised their hand and said, "Who gets that money?" And I said, "You do. You do, because it is the people who are running their businesses and the people who use the parks. Those benefits are accruing to the general public. And the general public owns the parks, right? And so it seems to me they should be treated better."
Well, I'm just wondering, 1,000 probationary people losing their jobs, the permission to hire 5,000 seasonals. We just went through a change of administrations. Is there staff in Washington to coordinate all these firings and hirings and deciding where the seasonals go and where the probationary workers get fired from? Who's making those decisions?
It's so funny because you're saying this like this is thought through and it's not, Kurt. Okay. Like you're saying it as if it's some logical thing where there's a person saying, oh, we got to make sure that there's an actual superintendent at Yosemite. No, there's that type of thinking is not occurring. And so, and one of the things that we've been watching for is there was also on top of all of this, this email that went out to all federal employees asking them to resign. And from our understanding, a couple hundred Park Service people did take that offer to resign. And so we're waiting to see if the HR people are sticking around at the Park Service, which is not clear at this point in time. So that's the worst part of this whole thing, is that it's not methodical. Other than law enforcement, we've seen no effort to actually ensure that other key positions are going to be filled as a result of all of these policies.
Have you heard anything on wildland firefighters?
We heard that a couple of firefighter positions have been restored at several parks, but we haven't fully confirmed that all of them have been restored. So
yeah, I reached out to the Park Service just the other day, and they did not have an answer for me. They said my question had been answered by Washington, and it had not been answered by Washington. I told the wildland firefighting branch, and they never got back to me. So, we're going into the firefighting season. I know there's some prescribed burns going on right now in Florida at Big Cypress. There's a story we ran on the Traveler just the other day about the southwestern parks. We're going to have an early fire season because of last summer's weak monsoon and the weak snowfall to date. And it's a good question of whether the Park Service is going to have firefighters on the ground to deal with it.
100%. And this has just been so tragic to hear from certain parks that they don't have enough of these positions filled already. When we've talked to some of the Western parks that are very fire prone, they're already having issues with local counties paying better salaries for firefighters than the Park Service pays. So there are already challenges to hiring firefighters, but this is just making matters worse.
On one hand, you've got the good news that 5,000 seasonals will be hired. You got the bad news that 1,000 probationary employees are losing their jobs. And you've got the writing on the wall, the executive order requiring that if a entity hires one person, they have to fire four. And Elon Musk hasn't even gotten to Interior Department yet. So how are things looking going forward in terms of staffing the Park Service?
Well, if you look back and look to today, there's been as I mentioned before, an average decline. And so the Park Service is understaffed as it is, underfunded as it is. And so by cutting more positions and by cutting budgets, or by passing a $3.1 billion budget as opposed to a bigger budget, it's going to make life more difficult for all the people who work in the national parks. And it's going to be bad news for park resources, and it's going to be bad news for visitor services. I was thinking about a situation that I saw in Yosemite where a person had driven their car off the road into the Merced River, and the water quickly was at the top of the roof. And so our rangers put up a rope system and were able to pull 8 people out of that car, through the sunroof. What would happen if there weren't enough people? What would happen if there was not someone to call and let people know what's going on? Are we just going to stand by and let this happen? I mean, it doesn't happen every day, but there are incidents that happen all the time in parks. It's still a very safe place to be. But we want it to be at the same level as it once was. Training is important. Equipment is important. We don't mention equipment enough. But some of the folks who are operating very old equipment, and I'll give you one quick story. On the Blue Ridge Parkway, a young lady from the University of Virginia was shot and killed on the Parkway. And so our rangers, upon being notified that this had occurred, jumped into their patrol car and it wouldn't work. So they had to ride to the to the scene in the back of a pickup truck. And so we're using old stuff, old techniques. We should be investing in the parks and not reducing them.
Kristen, you said that no thought has gone into what's happening to the Park Service staff in terms of, seasonal hires, permanent hires, probationary firings. Somebody might suggest that this was all intentional to force the federal government out of the parks and let concessionaires take over, let gateway towns take over. Is that a concern?
Of course, that's always a concern. Is privatizing parks has always been sort of this weird alternative that folks have proposed over the years. And in my time lobbying in Washington, D.C., there has always been this sort of dangling of privatization as the equivalent to having genuine Park Service staff. And let me just say, if someone's just making profits, we have seen what happens when park units open the door to entities that just want to make money. You have situations like we had on the mall here in DC where you had scooters everywhere, just everywhere, all over the mall, and just cluttering up the sidewalks and creating safety hazards with people. And the thing is, we know what happens when you crack that door open and you say, private industry, come in and see how you would run things. You'd have hang gliding and parachuting and all the crazy things that people have tried to do in national parks over the years because someone wants to make money. The greatest thing about our national parks, and Phil and me and you know, the reason the parks are so loved by the American public is because their goal, their whole purpose in law is to protect and conserve these resources for people to enjoy in perpetuity. Your enjoyment is dependent on protecting these places. That's how the Park Service's underlying law was written. How awesome is that? That in 1916, we had the forethought to say, we're just going to preserve these places and we're going to hire people to protect them and to make sure people have wonderful visitor experiences. And we're just going to do it for the sake of doing it because we feel like protecting places like the Grand Canyon is worth it, Yellowstone, Shenandoah, Everglades. And what is the result of that? You don't even need to do a poll. All you need to do is see that 325 million people are visiting these places to know how in love the public is with these national parks. So changing that mission from conserving resources for future generations to enjoy to making it a profit-making industry, that completely changes what our national parks are. And I think the public would reject that. It has decades and decades and decades of preserving the parks. The public has rejected that as an outcome, and we shouldn't stand for it. And if that's where all of this is heading, we absolutely need to make sure Congress and others step in and never allow that to happen. But we've seen when they've nipped at the edges of wanting to privatize parks, and all it does is create public safety nightmares and really unpleasant visitor experiences. So it's not worth it, and it would be a disaster for like my kids and all. It would be a shame if they couldn't experience the Grand Canyon like they did last year, and it was just a money-making venture. We actually were in that spot in the confluence at the Grand Canyon where they wanted to put a tram, and I reflected on it with my kids while we were there. I said, we're deep in a wilderness area right now, and there would have been a tram that comes down here with thousands of people a day. But no, there isn't one because it's a park, because it's protected. And you get to enjoy it and just enjoy this wilderness area. And those experiences would be gone because every crazy privatization idea would come to fruition. And so I would hope there would be amazing public outrage if we were to move in that direction.
One thing we haven't touched on is the morale at the National Park Service. I mean, it's already been the lowest, just about the lowest in the federal government morale because of the housing situation, because of the pay situation. This has not got to raise morale by getting rid of people.
Having experienced a RIF in a regional office, I can tell you that morale is terrible. They feel like that they don't care what happens to the employees. The employees feel that way. And the impacts can be really severe. I remember a single person who had several children and could barely make a go of it, lost their job just because of a RIF, some reason plucked out of the air that we needed to close this particular regional office. And so that will happen time and time again, different people in different circumstances. Morale is on the bottom now in the Park Service. It's one of the worst agencies morale-wise. It used to be like number 2. It was very high. I think it may have been number 1 as a great place to work. It's not considered that anymore.
What are you guys hearing from Congress? I mean, you both go to the Hill, you talk to the senators, you talk to representatives. I mean, I have frankly been shocked at how the Republican Party is moving in lockstep with the administration on some of these issues, on all these issues so far. Any pushback?
Yeah.
What's your sense, Kristen?
I spent all day yesterday up on the Hill talking to Republican offices mostly, but we've heard from Republicans, Democrats, Independents, everyone that they are very, very concerned about what could happen to the Park Service as a result of this hiring freeze and all the subsequent decisions. Multiple offices have sent letters into the administration, both Senate and House offices, raising specific concerns and national concerns. And we also know and have confirmed that Republican Senate offices have been calling Burgum and others at Interior about their concerns. So we know that we've done an excellent job lobbying over the years, and people understand the consequences, whether it's to the park itself and damaging the park, whether it's to visitor experience, or whether it's to the economy. You pick your issue as a member of Congress, what you're most concerned about, and some are concerned about the gateway communities losing money. One other issue that we haven't even broached yet, Kurt, is losing fee money.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of fee operators have been swept into these hiring freeze decisions. And will the parks that depend on entrance fee money continue to get that money to do basic operations in the parks? And so all of these issues have been brought forward by both members of Congress and economic, gateway communities. And so folks actually, have a good narrative on what the consequences are. But here's the deal. Congress hasn't done anything about any of these issues that are going on right now with the administration. They're talking a lot and they're raising concern, but we're not seeing a lot of action. And so at some point, we're going to need some more action here, and we're going to need the preservation of these staffing positions. But there's a lot of concern out there right now, but we need more action.
No, exactly, and that's my point. I mean, letter writing and phone calls from a senator or from a representative to the Interior Secretary is one thing, but this administration so far, we're only 3 weeks into it, has shown total disregard for Congress. Created a new agency, Department of Government Efficiency, without congressional approval, without congressional input. Made a private citizen in charge of this with no oversight. And Congress, at least on the Republican side, seems just to be going along with that and is happy with it.
That seems to be very true. I can't think of too many people who really taken a big step and stand up for the parks and stand up for their communities, stand up for their districts. In fact, I remember years ago, one congressman said, and this was back in the 90s, and back when we had this Government Performance Results Act. You remember that? And so each park and every Park Service office had to meet certain standards. And so the congressman said on TV, I saw it on TV, he said that if we take away the budget from the parks, then they'll fail to meet their standards. And once they don't fail to meet their standards, then we can contract them out. So not that many years ago, when I was still working for the Blue Ridge Parkway, I went to the adjacent national forest, and they have the same kind of economic benefit as a national park does. And so I was looking at this whole question about contracting out, because I was considering contracting out a campground. But what I found was they didn't recommend it. And the reason they didn't recommend it is that the contractor wanted only the profitable parts, of the operation. They were going to leave the unprofitable fixed cost part to the forest. And so that would certainly be true of the National Park Service. So it's not a great idea. I mean, I think this it's a great deal going to these national parks and at a minimum cost.
We haven't had a nominee for a permanent Park Service director. Frankly, I'm not sure who would take that job. But with these staff reductions, and if more are coming down the pike, might we see some parks close? And I don't think we'll see the crown jewels close, but you might see some of the smaller parks, the Fort Laramies of the world, or Hovenweep, or Natural Bridges. Is that a possibility?
I think we've already seen so many parks that the visitor centers only open a couple days a week. So the possibility of a full closure is highly possible and probable right now. And, and if you're a park superintendent or a park manager and you can't get the toilets clean, you got to make certain decisions to just tell people to move on to another spot and stop there. So these are the kinds of decisions that people are going to be making in those smaller parks is what are the risks and rewards for opening up your doors. And so, it's just a shame, when you think about it, and to think that we're now in this period of time where we're saying that Park Service staff, which make up such a infinitesimal amount of the federal budget, it's not worth it, that we want to prove a point that we're reducing the deficit by harming agencies like the Park Service. I hope the public isn't buying it. The Park Service is 1/15 of 1% of the federal budget. That is nothing compared to the benefits the public draws from these places. And so it is just such a fiction that you're going to save the federal deficit. You're going to save the country by slashing the Park Service's budget and staff. You are not. You are not going to save very much money toward that end, if that is your goal. So all of those folks who will probably add comments to this podcast and say, we have to make sacrifices, trust me, you are not saving enough money to make a sacrifice by harming the parks. The country makes more money for its GDP by keeping the parks running and operational. $55 billion from the parks go into our tourism spending in this country. The benefits way outweigh the cost of parks. And so it is not a good argument. You should not make the sacrifice. It's not worth it. And it is just a shame to leave a single park closed as a result of all of these bad decisions. And so folks, all of this stuff, what kills me about all of this, Kurt and Phil, is we have all this technology, right? We have all of these smart ways to look at solving problems, and yet you're using the most arcane tactic you could possibly come up with, which is just to say, we're just going to wipe out all of these positions, and you're not going to take a moment to think about what sacrifices you're making. It's kind of embarrassing at how arcane this whole thing has been, and thoughtless and careless and reckless, because we have the technology to think through these problems and to make better decisions, but we're not. And we're just going to sacrifice our history and our rivers and streams and clean air. We're just going to throw that up to a whim because we just want to make the most minor dent in our spending in this country. It is absolutely ridiculous. We are better than this. we are more advanced than this as a country, and the public shouldn't accept it.
Phil, I'm curious, again, test your memory here and test mine at the same time. Mike Finley, when he was superintendent of Yosemite National Park, he became so frustrated with the situation he was left with in managing the visitation to the Yosemite Valley that he threatened to close the gates to the valley. I can't remember if he actually closed the gates or if he just threatened it. But is there a superintendent out there today that would do something like that to make a statement?
I don't know. I don't know. I wouldn't want to speak for anyone else, but Mike certainly had that personality. He would stand up and say things to the Fresno Bee and to the San Francisco and Los Angeles papers that, were actually good for morale because he was supporting them and he was supporting the parks. He was not bashful, and I think he was a great role model for a superintendent. So, but can I go back to one thing here? And oftentimes the Park Service is criticized, for mismanagement. And when I arrived in the Smokies back in the 90s, it was obvious that the Smokies funding was way behind the Yosemites and the Yellowstones and even Mammoth Cave. And so we began, Karen Wade was superintendent, and we began to look for ways to be more efficient. And so we advertised that we were going to create a volunteer program. And so we put it in the local newspaper. We got 2,000 hits. We got 2,000 volunteers out of it. They shut down our phone system. So we've got a lot of things. And then the other thing is our use of friends groups and cooperating associations. I don't know what more we could have done, to be more efficient than the steps that we took back in the 90s and superintendents have been taking all around the country, to try to make the most of what they have. And then the other point, real quickly, is that the people who are being removed from the job today were tomorrow's leaders. These people are in permanent jobs. And had they been there longer, they would have advanced and been the next cadre of superintendents and regional directors, and maybe even a director out of one of those folks that's been fired.
So, Kristen, I was wondering, just the other day, the National Park Service went to the website for Stonewall National Monument in New York City and scrubbed it to remove the T for transgender and actually also the Q for queer, both on the homepage and through most of the site. I did find another reference to transgender, but what's your take on that?
Well, first, I just want to express that this is outrageous. And we should not accept any attack on the LGBTQ community. And these types of attacks are felt very broadly. And it's terrible for anyone in our country to feel like they're different from everyone else or not supported. And so we just first and foremost want to make sure that we're just expressing that this is terrible and no one should be treated this way.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to erase part of society.
Part of society and part of our history. And the whole reason that we worked so hard to designate Stonewall was to tell this story in an objective, correct way. And it has really been a place for the last 10 years where this civil rights story can be told. So to feel as though something is happening and moving this in the wrong direction and moving this process of establishing this park unit and really teaching visitors and all who come to Greenwich Village to the site the factual history of Stonewall. This process of starting to erase history, whether it be a website, materials, anything of that nature, we need to reject and we need to fight against. This is not why we have a National Park Service. And this is a cruel way to treat anyone in our society. And, this needs to be stopped on a general level and specifically here at the park unit. And I'm sure the staff, most excellent staff who work at Stonewall, are so upset about this and reject it themselves. And so we need to keep fighting this and make sure that the true history of Stonewall is told correctly and not erased. So we're going to continue to fight this. We will look into what the options are for fighting this and try to make sure we do everything we can to ensure the story is correctly told.
And you have to wonder what's next. Are they going to go after the civil rights sites next?
I hate to think that would even happen, Kurt. So I think we're just all waiting to see what the next thing is.
That's Kristen Brengel from the National Parks Conservation Association and Phil Francis from the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks. Depressing times we're going through. Hopefully we'll see a turn the other direction in the near future. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it informative. As always, for the latest news involving national parks and the National Park Service, make the National Parks Traveler part of your daily news binge. For the Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.